Private Tommy Garrett had been staring at the same section of barbed wire for 3 hours when he realized his relief should have arrived 40 minutes ago. Or maybe it shouldn't have come for another 20. The numbness in his legs had spread to his thoughts, and somewhere in that fog between exhaustion and alertness, he'd lost track of which schedule they were following tonight. If this topic resonates with you, subscribe and support the episode. The jungle beyond the wire didn't care about schedules. It breathed and clicked and rustled with 1,000 invisible movements, each one potentially lethal, most of them just the island doing what islands do when men try to carve camps out of their flesh. New Guinea, they called it, though there was nothing new about the rot that ate through boot leather in 3 days, or the mosquitoes that seemed to operate in organized squadrons. Garrett shifted his weight from his left foot to his right, felt water squelch inside his sock, and kept his eyes on the wire. The Enfield rifle in his hands was slick with humidity, despite the rag he'd wrapped around the stock. Behind him, somewhere in the network of foxholes and weapon pits that made up the perimeter, someone coughed. The sound carried wrong in the thick air, seemed to come from 3 directions at once. Garrett didn't turn. Turning meant taking your eyes off the wire, and the wire was everything. It wasn't much, just a few strands of rusted steel wrapped around stakes driven into mud that wanted to swallow them. But it was the line between the camp and whatever waited in that wall of vegetation 30 yards away. Men had died learning that the jungle didn't need much space to hide an entire patrol. A sound reached him from the left, footsteps in mud, deliberate and unhurried. Garrett's finger moved to the trigger guard but didn't enter it. Not yet. The footsteps belonged to someone who knew where they were going, which meant friendly or enemy, confident enough not to care. His relief would come from behind the line, through the marked path between the pits. These steps were coming along the wire itself, from the direction of second section's position. The figure materialized out of the darkness like a photograph developing in chemical bath. Corporal Davies, moving with the careful gait of a man who'd learned that hurrying in the dark got you shot by your own side. He carried his Owen gun at a loose ready, barrel pointed at the ground, but a hand's twitch away from coming up. When he got close enough for Garrett to see his face in the ambient starlight that filtered through the canopy, Davies wasn't smiling. Quote 0, Davies said, voice barely above a whisper. Quote 1. Garrett waited, but no Brennan appeared behind the corporal. Quote 2. Quote 3. Quote 4. Davies looked at Garrett like he'd asked what color the moon was. Does it matter? Move. It did matter, in the way that patterns mattered, in the way that knowing when you could let your guard down for 30 seconds to light a cigarette mattered. Garrett had been on this perimeter for 6 nights, and not once had the rotations happened at the same interval. The first night, he'd stood 4 hours. The second, just under 3. Third night, nearly 5, until he'd been ready to fall asleep standing up and had started slapping himself to stay alert. No one explained it. The sergeant just appeared or sent someone, tapped you out, sent you to a different position or back to get 2 hours of sleep before they needed you somewhere else. Garrett pulled himself away from the wire, legs protesting, and started back toward the interior of the camp. The command pit was just a glorified hole in the ground with a canvas sheet that leaked, but it was where Lieutenant Morrison tried to run a war with a map that was already 3 weeks out of date and intelligence reports that contradicted each other. Garrett had been there once, when he'd first arrived, and Morrison had explained where not to walk unless he wanted to lose a foot to a mine they'd laid themselves, and already half forgotten about. The camp was a maze of shallow trenches connecting fighting positions, supply dumps covered in camouflage netting, and men trying to sleep in conditions that made sleep a theoretical concept. Garrett passed Harris, who was supposed to be resting, but was instead sitting on the edge of his foxhole cleaning his rifle by touch in the dark. Harris didn't look up. No one talked more than necessary at night. Sound carried, and carrying sound meant teaching the Japanese where to aim mortars. Morrison was in the command pit with Sergeant Dalton when Garrett arrived, both of them bent over a map with a shielded torch that gave off about as much light as a dying firefly. Dalton looked up first, his face all hard angles in the shadows. He'd been in North Africa before this, had the look of a man who'd already used up several lifetimes' worth of luck, and was now running on spite and cigarettes. Quote 6, Dalton said, not a question, just acknowledgement. Quote 7. Quote 8, Quote 9. Garrett thought about lying, about saying he hadn't noticed, but Dalton had a way of knowing when you were feeding him what you thought he wanted to hear. No pattern, Sergeant. Feels random. Dalton smiled, though there wasn't much warmth in it. Quote 11. He straightened up, worked a kink out of his back. Quote 12. Garrett opened his mouth to answer, but Morrison cut in before he could speak. The lieutenant was young for his rank, probably 25, with the kind of university accent that usually got a man hazed in the ranks until he learned to talk like everyone else. But Morrison had been at Milne Bay, had the kind of quiet authority that came from having already survived what killed better men. Quote 13. Dalton pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket, the kind you could buy at any stationer's in Sydney for 3p. The pages were warped from humidity and spotted with mold, but the pencil marks were still legible. He flipped it open to a page covered in times and dates, columns of numbers that might have been a shipping manifest or a train schedule. 9th of August, B Company, Dobadura. Enemy patrol penetrated their perimeter at 02:15, exactly when they were rotating sentries. Killed 3 men, wounded 2 more, disappeared before anyone could organize a response. 15th of August, D Company, same area. Mortar barrage at midnight, right when they were changing the watch. Caught men in the open. Lost 5. He turned a page. The list continued. Garrett felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the tinned meat they'd eaten for dinner. Morrison said, keeping his voice low. Quote 16. Garrett thought about the 3 hours he'd just spent staring at the vegetation. Thought about how many times he'd glanced at his watch. Thought about how a man hidden in that tangle of vines and rotting logs would have a perfect view of the perimeter. Thought about how easy it would be to notice that Private Garrett got relieved at 2200 every night, regular as clockwork, and how a smart enemy would know exactly when to move. Quote 17. Dalton said, closing the notebook. Quote 18. He lit a cigarette, cupping the flame carefully. Quote 19. The implications spread out in Garrett's mind like ripples in water. No pattern meant no rest cycle you could count on. Meant you might stand watch for 6 hours straight, or get pulled after 90 minutes. Meant you couldn't plan anything, couldn't settle into the numbing rhythm that made this bearable. Meant staying alert because you never knew when your relief would come, if it would come, whether the footsteps behind you were friendly or something else. You're putting us on edge on purpose, Garrett said slowly, keeping us uncertain. Keeping you alive, Morrison corrected. Uncertainty works both ways. Right now, there's a Japanese observer somewhere out there, probably several of them, taking shifts of their own, trying to figure out our patterns. Every night they watch, they write down times, they try to build a picture of when we're vulnerable. And every night, we give them nothing useful, nothing they can act on. After a while, that uncertainty becomes doubt. Doubt becomes caution. Caution means they wait longer, plan more carefully, second-guess themselves, all of which gives us more time to spot them before they make their move. Dalton exhaled smoke through his nose. There's more to it. We've started varying other routines too. Ration distribution, patrol departures, radio checks. Anything that happens on a schedule becomes something that doesn't happen on a schedule. It's exhausting, and it makes proper military order nearly impossible. But proper military order is what gets you killed when the enemy's taking notes. A sound reached them from outside the pit, voices raised in anger somewhere near the supply dump. Morrison's hand went to his pistol automatically, then relaxed when the argument stayed verbal. Someone was unhappy about something, which described most of the camp most of the time. The real danger was when things went quiet. Garrett asked. Morrison interrupted. He leaned back against the wall of the pit. Quote 29. Garrett tried to imagine it from the other side. Japanese soldiers, well-trained and disciplined, crouched in the undergrowth with grenades and bayonets, waiting for the moment when the Australians would be vulnerable. Waiting for a pattern that used to exist. Watching the confusion, the irregular movements, the guards who stayed too long or left too early. Realizing that something had changed, that the intelligence they'd gathered was now worthless. Sergeant Dalton dismissed Garrett back to his rest area, such as it was. A section of trench with a ground sheet that had more holes than fabric, and a mosquito net that the insects treated as a suggestion rather than a barrier. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sounds of the jungle and the knowledge that someone might shake him awake in 20 minutes or 2 hours. No way to know which. He'd just started to drift off when he felt a boot nudge his shoulder. Quote, 30, said a voice he didn't recognize immediately. His hand found the rifle before his eyes opened properly. Collins, one of the newer replacements, stood over him with the uncomfortable expression of a man delivering bad news. Sergeant wants you on the wire again. Southeast corner, relieving Jackson. Garrett checked his watch out of habit, though the information was meaningless now. 45 minutes since Dalton had sent him to rest. He pulled himself up, every muscle protesting, and followed Collins through the trench system toward the perimeter. The southeast corner was the worst position, where the jungle pressed closest to the wire and the ground turned to swamp that never quite dried even in the middle of the day. Jackson was there, leaning against a support post in a way that suggested he was holding himself upright through will alone. "Thank Christ," Jackson muttered when he saw Garrett. "Thought I was going to grow roots." He didn't wait for a response, just stumbled past toward the interior, leaving Garrett alone with the wire and the darkness and the certainty that he'd be here for an unknowable amount of time. The next 3 days blurred together into a cycle of interrupted sleep and perimeter duty that followed no logic Garrett could identify. Sometimes he stood watch for 20 minutes before being rotated to a different position. Once he spent nearly 7 hours at the same spot, until he'd started hallucinating movement in the tree line and had to bite the inside of his cheek to stay focused. The other men in his section were experiencing the same disorientation. Harris stopped asking what time shifts would end. Young Blake, fresh from training camp in Queensland, developed a twitch under his left eye that wouldn't go away. On the 4th day, Dalton gathered the section in a cleared area behind the command pit, where the jungle had been hacked back enough to create something resembling a briefing space. 11 men sat on ammunition boxes, or stood with their rifles, looking at the sergeant with the wariness of soldiers who'd learned that gatherings usually preceded unpleasant orders. Quote 34, Dalton began, which was unexpected enough that everyone paid attention. Quote 35. He pulled out a cigarette, but didn't light it, just rolled it between his fingers. There was a bloke named Nichols, good mate of mine, steady hand in a fight. He had the watch from 2000 to midnight at the north edge of our position. On the 5th night of the battle, at exactly 23:55, 5 minutes before the scheduled change, a German patrol hit his position. They'd been watching us, you see, worked out our rotation schedule, knew that at 23:55, Nichols would be tired, thinking about his relief arriving any minute, maybe already hearing footsteps of the man coming to replace him. His attention would be split, just for a moment. The cigarette snapped between Dalton's fingers. He looked down at it like he'd forgotten he was holding it, then let the pieces fall. They put a grenade right into his foxhole. Nichols died thinking his relief was early. The explosion killed the man who was actually coming to replace him too. 2 dead because we were predictable, because someone had been watching long enough to set their watch by our movements. Nobody spoke. Somewhere in the distance, a bird made a sound like laughter, high and mocking. Dalton finally lit a new cigarette, took a long drag, and continued. After Crete came Tobruk. Same story, different desert. The Germans and Italians would probe our lines, looking for patterns. When they found them, they exploited them. Lost good men because we insisted on running our defense like it was a peacetime garrison, everything neat and scheduled and predictable. He pointed the cigarette at the assembled men like it was a weapon. Now we're here, and the Japanese are even better at this game than the Germans were. They'll sit in that jungle for weeks, watching, learning, writing everything down in their little notebooks. Then one night, they'll come through the wire at exactly the moment when they know you'll be distracted, tired, expecting your relief. Unless we don't give them that moment. Unless we make it impossible for them to predict anything about how we operate. Blake raised a hand hesitantly. Sergeant, how long do we have to keep this up? The irregular rotations. I mean, it's making it hard to... To what? Dalton cut him off. To sleep properly? To have a routine? Welcome to war, Private. It's supposed to be hard. The question is whether you want it to be hard because you're tired and confused, or hard because you're dead. Harris spoke up from the back. But, sir, if we're all exhausted from not knowing when we'll be relieved, doesn't that make us less effective? More likely to miss something? It was a fair question, and Dalton's expression suggested he'd been waiting for someone to ask it. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But here's what intelligence has noticed. Since we started irregular rotations 2 weeks ago, attempted infiltrations are down 40% across the battalion. The Japanese are being more cautious, taking longer to plan their approaches, second-guessing their observations, because they can't trust their intelligence anymore. They don't know if what they saw yesterday still applies today. Morrison emerged from the command pit, joining Dalton. The lieutenant had a folder under his arm, the kind that usually contained reports or orders from higher headquarters. There's something else you should know, Morrison said. Morrison opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in typewritten text and hand-drawn diagrams. This arrived yesterday from brigade headquarters. Captain Wellsworth, intelligence officer, has been compiling data from multiple battalions across the division. What we're doing here, the irregular rotations, it's part of a larger pattern he's identified. He held up one of the diagrams, a chart showing dates and times in incident reports. Over the past 2 months, there have been 23 successful enemy infiltrations of Australian positions in this sector. Wellsworth went through every after-action report, interviewed survivors, cross-referenced with captured Japanese documents we found on dead scouts. The chart made a grim kind of sense once you understood what you were looking at. Clusters of incidents, all occurring within a narrow window around shift change times. Morrison tapped the paper with his finger. 16 of those 23 attacks happened within 10 minutes of scheduled sentry rotations. That's not coincidence. That's operational intelligence being put to use. The Japanese have been systematically observing our defensive routines and timing their attacks to exploit them. Garrett thought about the 3 men from B Company that Dalton had mentioned, killed during a shift change. Thought about how many others had died the same way, caught in that vulnerable moment when old guards were leaving and new ones arriving, when attention was divided and positions were temporarily weakened. The Japanese weren't just getting lucky. They were hunting for patterns the same way you'd hunt for animal tracks, learning the habits of their prey. Wellsworth is convinced there's an organized intelligence gathering operation, Morrison continued. Not just random patrols stumbling across our positions, but dedicated observation teams. They're out there right now, probably within 100 yards of this perimeter, watching everything we do. How many men we have, where we place our weapons, when we eat, when we sleep, and especially when we change guards. They're building a complete picture of our defensive behavior. Dalton took over. Which is why we're not just changing rotation times randomly. We're changing everything. Starting tomorrow, ration distribution won't follow a schedule. Patrols will depart at irregular intervals. Radio checks with battalion headquarters will happen whenever Morrison feels like it. Not every 2 hours like the manual says. We're turning this entire position into something unpredictable. Something they can't pattern. Blake looked like he wanted to object, but couldn't quite find the words. It was Harris who voiced what several of them were probably thinking. Morrison said, without humor. He pulled out another document, this one with a red confidential stamp across the top. Quote, 5-5. The image stuck in Garrett's mind, a Japanese officer dying in the jungle with a notebook full of lies, or at least truths that were no longer true. War by confusion. Victory through unpredictability. It wasn't the kind of thing they taught you in training, where everything was about discipline and routine and following orders exactly as written. Dalton dismissed the briefing, but he pulled Garrett aside before he could leave. Quote 56. He paused, studying Garrett's face in the fading light. You holding up all right? Some of the men are struggling with this, not knowing when they'll sleep, when they'll eat, when they'll be on duty. Garrett considered lying, saying he was fine, but Dalton had that look that suggested honesty was the only acceptable answer. It's strange, Sergeant. Makes everything feel unstable, but I understand why we're doing it. Understanding doesn't make it easier, Dalton said. Just remember, if you're feeling unstable and uncertain, imagine how the Japanese scouts feel. They're trying to plan an assault based on intelligence that keeps changing. Every night they watch us, they see something different. Different timing, different positions, different routines. Eventually, that uncertainty becomes a weapon. They start to doubt their observations. Doubt leads to caution. Caution means they wait. And every night they wait is another night we're still alive. Garrett returned to his section's area and tried to rest, knowing that rest was now something that happened in stolen moments rather than scheduled blocks. Collins was cleaning his rifle with obsessive attention to detail, the kind of busy work soldiers did when they couldn't control anything else. Jackson sat staring at nothing, probably running through the same mental calculations Garrett had been doing, trying to guess when he'd be called up next, knowing the guess was pointless. The sun dropped below the jungle canopy, and darkness came quickly in this part of the world. No twilight, just day turning to night like someone flipping a switch. Garrett waited. 30 minutes passed. An hour. He started to wonder if Dalton had forgotten about him, then remembered that wondering was exactly what they wanted him to do. Uncertainty as doctrine. When the call finally came, it wasn't from Dalton. It was Private Walsh, appearing out of the darkness with orders to relieve Henderson at the northeast position. Garrett grabbed his rifle and followed, his internal clock completely disoriented. The perimeter waited, and somewhere beyond it, patient eyes watched and tried to make sense of patterns that no longer existed. Henderson looked like a man who'd aged a decade in a single watch. His eyes had that 1,000-yard stare that came from hours of focusing on nothing and everything simultaneously, searching the darkness for movement that might or might not be there. When Garrett tapped his shoulder, Henderson flinched hard enough that his rifle came up before recognition set in. _quote_61_, he breathed. Quote 62, quote 63, Garrett asked, settling into position as Henderson gathered his gear. Quote 64. Henderson paused before leaving, turned back. Quote 65. The information sat heavy in Garrett's chest as Henderson disappeared into the trench system. Movement past the wire, deliberate and human. Could be Japanese scouts doing exactly what Morrison had described, watching and recording. Could be a patrol preparing to probe the defenses. Could be nothing, just the jungle playing tricks on exhausted minds. No way to know which, and that uncertainty was worse than any confirmed threat. Garrett scanned the tree line, looking for anything that didn't belong. The wire stretched away to either side, a pathetic barrier that wouldn't stop anyone determined to cross it, but served as a tripwire, a noisemaker, a psychological boundary. Beyond it, the jungle was a solid wall of black, punctuated by slightly less black shapes that might be trees, or might be men standing very still. His ears did most of the work in this darkness, sorting through the ambient noise for anything artificial. Insects, always the insects. Rustling that could be wind, or could be something else. The distant sound of the ocean, miles away but carrying through the humid air. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing without pattern. Garrett found himself checking his watch every few minutes, then forcing himself to stop because the numbers meant nothing anymore. 2100 became 2130, became 2200. No relief came. His legs started to cramp. He shifted weight carefully, moving as little as possible, aware that any silhouette change might be visible to watchers in the jungle. At what his watch claimed was 2240, he heard it. The same sound Henderson must have heard. Movement in the undergrowth, maybe 40 yards out. Too heavy for a small animal, too controlled for something random. Garrett's hand tightened on his rifle, finger moving to the trigger guard. The movement stopped. Silence, thick and expectant. He wanted to call out, demand identification, but training held him quiet. Calling out would confirm his position, tell anyone listening exactly where he was. Minutes crawled past. Nothing. Then, so faint he almost missed it, a different sound. Voices, speaking Japanese, low and urgent. Too far away to make out words even if he spoke the language, but close enough to confirm what Henderson had suspected. They were out there, watching. The voices stopped as suddenly as they'd started. Garrett stayed frozen, barely breathing, counting seconds. At 200, he allowed himself to move again, just enough to ease the screaming tension in his shoulders. Davies materialized beside him without warning, moving with the kind of silence that came from practice and fear. "Anything?" he whispered. Movement at 2240. Voices speaking Japanese, maybe 50 yards out. Brief, then nothing. Davies nodded like this was expected news. "Third position to report the same tonight. They're out there, making observations. Probably frustrated as hell that we keep changing things on them." He checked his own watch. "You're here for another hour, maybe 2. Morrison's orders. When your relief comes, you're to report to him directly. He wants to talk to anyone who's heard them tonight." The prospect of another hour or 2 at the wire would have been unbearable a week ago. Now it was just another variable in an equation that had lost all constants. Davies slipped away, continuing his rounds, leaving Garrett alone with the wire and the darkness, and the knowledge that hostile eyes were cataloging his every movement. The night deepened. Garrett's vision adjusted as much as it was going to, finding gradations of shadow that might mean something or nothing. A shape that looked like a crouching man resolved into a fallen log. A gap in the foliage that seemed like a path was just an accident of growth patterns. The mind created threats out of absence, filled empty spaces with possibility. He'd read once that human brains were wired to see faces and patterns everywhere, a survival mechanism that sometimes worked against you in situations like this. At 0115 by his watch, Collins appeared to relieve him. "Morrison wants you at the command pit. Now." Collins looked rough, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, uniform stained with mud and sweat that never quite dried in this climate. They all looked like that now. The irregular schedules were taking a toll that went beyond simple tiredness. Men were becoming irritable, jumpy, prone to mistakes born of fatigue. Morrison was awake despite the hour, studying maps by the light of a heavily shielded lamp. Dalton was there too, along with 3 other men Garrett recognized from different sections. The lieutenant looked up as Garrett entered the pit, gestured for him to sit on an ammunition crate. "You heard Japanese voices tonight. How many speakers?" 2 at least, sir. Maybe 3. Hard to tell with the jungle distorting sound." Morrison made a note on a pad. Harris reported 2 voices at his position around 2100. Jackson heard 3 distinct speakers at 2300 from the southeast corner. Matheson had similar contact at his station. He tapped the map with his pencil, marking positions. "They're running multiple observation posts, coordinating coverage of our entire perimeter. Professional work. Disciplined." "Are they planning an attack, sir?" one of the other men asked. "Planning something," Morrison replied. "Whether it's an attack or just intelligence gathering for future operations, we don't know. What we do know is they're investing significant resources in watching us. That means they consider this position important enough to warrant detailed reconnaissance." He looked at each of them in turn. "It also means our irregular procedures are working. If they had what they needed, they wouldn't still be out there watching." Dalton lit a cigarette, the brief flare of the match illuminating his weathered features before he shook it out. "The question is, what they do when they realize they can't establish a pattern. Do they give up and move on to softer targets, or do they try something different?" He exhaled smoke slowly. "My experience says they adapt. The Japanese are patient, methodical, but they're not stupid. If observation isn't giving them what they need, they'll probe, test our responses, try to force us into revealing our procedures under pressure." Morrison nodded agreement. "Which is why we're implementing Phase 2 starting tomorrow. We've denied them the ability to predict our routines. Now we need to actively feed them false information. Make them think they've found patterns that don't actually exist." The idea hung in the air for a moment while everyone processed it. Harris spoke first. "How do you feed false information to someone watching through field glasses, sir?" "By being predictable in ways that don't matter," Morrison said. "For instance, we start having ration distribution happen at exactly 0800 every morning. Very regular, very visible. Anyone watching will note it down, think they've found a routine. But ration distribution isn't a security vulnerability. It doesn't create exploitable gaps in our defense. Meanwhile, actual guard rotations remain random. Dalton added, "We might have patrols depart at the same time for 3 nights running, then change it completely. Let them think they've worked out our pattern, then prove them wrong when it matters. The goal is to make them doubt everything they observe. Some of it's real, some of it's theater, and they won't know which is which." Garrett tried to imagine maintaining that kind of deception while also staying genuinely unpredictable where it counted. It seemed like a recipe for confusion, for accidentally creating real patterns while trying to fake false ones. "Won't that confuse us as much as them, sir?" "Probably," Morrison admitted. "That's why we're only doing it with non-essential activities. Things that don't directly impact our defensive capability. The core elements, sentry rotations, weapons positioning, response protocols, those stay random. Everything else becomes a show for whoever's watching." The meeting broke up near 0200, and Garrett was told to get some rest before his next rotation, whenever that might be. Sleep came in jagged pieces, interrupted by sounds both real and imagined. He woke to full daylight and the smell of something that might generously be called breakfast. Tinned meat that had probably been sitting in some warehouse since before the war started, mixed with rice that had weevils in it more often than not. Men picked out the insects mechanically, ate what remained without complaint. Hunger overrode disgust after a while. The morning was quiet, almost peaceful if you ignored the omnipresent tension. Garrett watched as rations were distributed at exactly 0800, men forming orderly lines in full view of the jungle. Morrison's theater, performed for an audience that might or might not be watching. Davies made a show of checking his watch, announcing the time loudly. Quote, 89. Several men caught on to what was happening and played along, discussing how reliable the timing was, how you could set your watch by it. 3 days passed in a blur of irregular shifts and carefully staged routines. The false patterns Morrison had implemented became more elaborate. Mail call happened at 1400 each afternoon, announced with unnecessary volume. Equipment maintenance formed up at 1000, men sitting in neat rows cleaning weapons where the jungle could see them. Everything designed to look like clockwork, like a predictable garrison that followed regulations to the letter. But the wire rotations remained chaotic. Garrett found himself pulled from sleep at random hours, sent to different positions without warning, relieved when he least expected it. Sometimes he stood watch for 45 minutes, sometimes for 6 hours. The lack of pattern became its own kind of routine, the routine of no routine. His body stopped trying to anticipate rest periods, learned to sleep in whatever fragments it could get. On the 4th night of the new protocol, things changed. Garrett was at the northwest position, had been there for what felt like hours, but might have been 30 minutes, when he heard movement again. This time it was closer, maybe 20 yards beyond the wire, not trying to be subtle anymore. He raised his rifle, peering into the darkness, and saw shapes, multiple shapes, low to the ground, advancing with purpose. Quote 90, he hissed to Jackson, who was positioned 10 feet to his left. Quote 91. Jackson saw them too. Quote 92. Before Garrett could answer, a flare went up from the southeast corner. The night turned brilliant white, harsh shadows leaping across the ground. In that sudden illumination, Garrett saw them clearly. 6 Japanese soldiers, frozen in the open between the jungle and the wire, caught like animals in a spotlight. For a suspended moment, nobody moved, both sides stunned by the unexpected visibility. Then, everything happened at once. The Japanese scattered, diving for cover. Rifle fire erupted from multiple positions along the perimeter. Too much fire, men shooting at shadows and movement in fear. Garrett squeezed off 2 rounds at a retreating figure, saw it stumble but couldn't tell if he'd hit anything. The flare died, plunging everything back into darkness that seemed absolute after the brightness. His ears rang from the shooting. Voices shouted in the confusion. Australian voices calling for ceasefire, Japanese voices yelling something he couldn't understand. Silence crashed down like a physical weight. Garrett's heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat. Quote 93. Davies' voice cut through the darkness. Calls came back negative from around the perimeter. No friendly casualties. Whether they'd hit any of the Japanese was impossible to know. Morrison appeared at Garrett's position within minutes, Dalton right behind him. What did you see? The lieutenant demanded. 6 hostiles, advancing on the wire. Got within 20 yards before the flare went up. They scattered when we opened fire. They weren't sneaking, Jackson added. They were moving deliberately, like they knew when they wanted to be here. Morrison and Dalton exchanged a look that Garrett couldn't read in the darkness. Quote 98, Morrison asked. Quote 99, Dalton swore quietly. Quote 100. Morrison called a full stand-to, every available man on the perimeter with weapons ready, expecting a follow-up assault that never came. The Japanese had withdrawn completely, melted back into the jungle like they'd never been there. When dawn finally broke, a patrol went out to search the area where the contact had occurred. They found blood on the vegetation, drag marks in the mud, and a single leather pouch containing a small notebook and a pencil worn down to a stub. The notebook came back to Morrison's command pit, where it sat on the map table like evidence at a trial. The pages were filled with precise handwriting in Japanese characters, columns of times and observations that Captain Wellsworth would need to translate properly. But even without reading the language, the structure was clear. Systematic intelligence collection, the kind of meticulous record-keeping that spoke to professional military training. Quote 101, Morrison said, flipping through the pages carefully. Quote 102. He stopped at a page near the end, pointed to a series of entries that all had the same time notation. Quote 103. Wellsworth arrived from brigade headquarters that afternoon, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked more like a university lecturer than a soldier. He spent 2 hours going through the notebook with Morrison and Dalton, translating the contents, building a picture of what the Japanese had learned and what they'd gotten wrong. When he finished, his assessment was both encouraging and deeply unsettling. They've been watching you for 19 days, Wellsworth said, consulting his notes. Multiple observers working in rotation, which explains why sentries kept hearing voices at different times. Very professional operation. They documented guard positions, approach routes, fields of fire, everything you'd need for a successful assault. He paused, adjusted his glasses. But their conclusions are inconsistent. They note that rotations appear to happen at 2200 hours on several occasions, but also at 2130, 2300, and once at 0100. They can't reconcile the data. There are question marks in the margins, notes indicating uncertainty. Dalton leaned back in his chair. So they gambled, picked the time that appeared most frequently and committed to it, hoping they'd guessed right. And got shot at for their trouble, Morrison added. The question is whether they'll try again or report back that this position is too unpredictable to hit safely. Wellsworth shook his head. There's something else in here that concerns me. The last entry, made yesterday afternoon. It's not an observation, it's a conclusion. He found the page, translated aloud. Australian defensive procedures do not follow standard military doctrine. Recommend extended observation period or alternative approach. Unit appears aware of surveillance and has implemented counterintelligence measures. The implications settled over the command pit like fog. They know we know, Morrison said quietly. They figured out that we're being deliberately unpredictable. Which means they'll adapt, Wellsworth agreed. The Japanese are excellent at tactical flexibility. If observation isn't working, they'll try something else. Might increase the frequency of probing attacks. Try to force you into revealing your response procedures. Might bring in heavier weapons. Try to suppress your position so thoroughly that your defensive patterns become irrelevant. Or they might just decide you're too much trouble and focus their efforts elsewhere. Garrett was called to the briefing along with several others who'd been on the wire during the contact. Wellsworth wanted first-hand accounts of the attempted infiltration, details about how the Japanese had moved, their apparent objectives, their reaction when discovered. Garrett described what he'd seen in the flare's brief illumination. 6 men advancing in a loose line, weapons ready but not firing until fired upon, moving like they expected to find the wire lightly defended or in the middle of a shift change. Quote, 116, Wellsworth observed. Quote, 117, Morrison checked his notes. Quote, 118. Quote, 119, Wellsworth made notes in a separate book. Official observations that would go into some report that would climb the chain of command. Underscore quote underscore 120 underscore. Over the following week, the nature of enemy contact changed. Instead of silent observation, Japanese patrols started probing the perimeter at random intervals, quick rushes toward the wire followed by immediate withdrawal, never staying long enough to develop into a full assault. Sometimes they came at 0200, sometimes at 1500, in broad daylight, sometimes twice in one night, with hours between attempts. Each probe seemed designed to test response times, force the Australians to reveal their defensive procedures under pressure. Morrison countered by further randomizing everything. Guard positions rotated not just in time, but in location, men moving to different sections of the perimeter mid-shift. Communication protocols changed daily. Even the paths between positions varied. New routes cut through the defensive network to prevent anyone from establishing safe approach vectors. The camp became a fluid thing, constantly rearranging itself like a living organism adapting to threats. The strain showed in every face. Blake's eye twitch had spread to his hands, a tremor that made him struggle with simple tasks like loading magazines. Harris stopped talking almost entirely, communicated in grunts and nods. Collins developed a habit of checking his watch compulsively every few minutes, even though the information was meaningless. Sleep deprivation accumulated like debt, impossible to repay with the scattered rest periods that came at unpredictable intervals. On the 10th night after the contact, Garrett was pulled from sleep at 0300 and sent to the eastern wire. Jackson was already there, looking like a corpse that someone had propped up with a rifle. "How long you been here?" Garrett asked. Jackson had to think about it. "Since yesterday afternoon sometime. Or maybe this morning. I don't know anymore. Time's all mixed up." His voice was flat, exhausted beyond emotion. "Davies came by twice, said he'd send relief soon. That was hours ago. Or minutes. Can't tell." Before Garrett could respond, the jungle erupted with gunfire. Not the careful aimed shots of a probe, but sustained automatic fire from multiple positions. Tracers cut through the darkness like deadly fireflies. The wire sang as bullets struck it, sparks flying where rounds hit metal stakes. Men dove for cover all along the perimeter, returning fire blindly into the jungle, the night dissolving into chaos and noise and the smell of cordite. The attack lasted 7 minutes by Garrett's watch, though it felt like hours compressed into heartbeats. Japanese machine guns hammered the perimeter from at least 3 positions, coordinated fire designed to suppress rather than penetrate. Mortars followed, rounds dropping into the camp with methodical precision, walking across the defensive positions in a pattern that suggested the enemy had good intelligence on the layout, despite all the randomization. Men scrambled for the deepest cover they could find as explosions tore through the night, dirt and shrapnel raining down between detonations. Then, as suddenly as it started, the fire stopped. Silence rushed back in, broken only by ringing ears and the groans of wounded men. Garrett stayed pressed against the bottom of his foxhole, rifle ready, waiting for the follow-up assault that Doctrine said should come when defenders were still disoriented from the barrage. But no assault came. The jungle returned to its usual cacophony of insects and nightbirds, as if nothing had happened. Quote, 124 Davies's voice cut through the darkness, moving along the perimeter. "Sound off by position." The count came back grim. 3 dead, Morrison among them, killed by a mortar round that had landed directly in the command pit. 5 wounded seriously enough to need immediate evacuation. Another dozen with minor injuries, cuts from flying debris, and temporary deafness from the explosions. Dalton had survived, emerging from a covered trench with blood running down the side of his face from a shrapnel graze that he ignored completely. "That wasn't a probe," Dalton said, to no one in particular, surveying the damage as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. "That was a statement. They were showing us they can hit us whenever they want, pattern or no pattern. The randomization didn't matter because they just saturated the entire perimeter. Captain Fletcher arrived from C Company within the hour, senior officer now that Morrison was dead. He was older than Morrison had been, a veteran of the First War who'd somehow ended up back in uniform for this one. His face had the kind of lines that came from decades of bad news delivered and received. He walked the perimeter with Dalton, examining the damage, talking to survivors, building a picture of what had happened. Fletcher concluded, standing near the crater where Morrison had died. Quote 129. He lit a cigarette with hands that were perfectly steady despite the carnage around him. Quote 130. Wellsworth returned that afternoon with new intelligence that added another dimension to the picture. Quote 131. He spread a map on what was left of the command table. Quote 132. Dalton absorbed this, his expression unreadable beneath the bandage someone had finally convinced him to accept. Quote 133. Quote 134. Fletcher said. Quote 135. He studied the map, tracing defensive positions with one finger. Quote 136. The irregularity extended into crisis response. Chaos layered on chaos. Garrett found himself moved 3 times in the day following the attack, never staying in one position long enough to learn its quirks and vulnerabilities. Every man in the company went through the same rotation, a constant shuffle that meant nobody could predict where anyone else would be at any given moment. The Japanese had proven they could observe positions, so Fletcher made the positions meaningless by ensuring the defenders were never where they'd been seen before. 2 nights later, another barrage hit the perimeter. This time it targeted the south side exclusively, a concentrated bombardment that suggested the enemy thought they'd identified a weak point. But the weak point didn't exist anymore. Fletcher had reinforced that section immediately after the first attack, moved a Vickers machine gun crew into a carefully concealed position with overlapping fields of fire. When the shelling stopped, and Japanese infantry rushed forward expecting minimal resistance, they ran into carefully prepared defenses that cut them down before they reached the wire. The survivors withdrew, leaving their dead in the open. Garrett watched from his position as dawn revealed the cost of the enemy's gamble. 8 bodies sprawled in the killing zone, equipment scattered, weapons abandoned in the rush to escape. A patrol went out cautiously to recover what intelligence they could from the corpses. They found more notebooks, more observations, all dated from before Fletcher's reshuffling of positions. The Japanese had acted on intelligence that was 72 hours old, and paid for the mistake. They're struggling with the same problem we are, Wellsworth observed when he examined the recovered documents. How do you plan an attack when the defensive arrangement changes faster than you can observe it? Their solution seems to be accepting higher casualties in exchange for forcing us to reveal current positions through combat. He translated a passage from one of the notebooks. This entry, dated 2 days ago, notes that Australian defensive doctrine appears to be in constant flux, recommends against conventional assault tactics, suggests prolonged harassment operations instead. Fletcher nodded slowly. Harassment we can handle. It's exhausting, it's dangerous, but it's survivable. What we couldn't handle was them knowing exactly when and where to hit us. As long as we maintain unpredictability, as long as they can't establish reliable patterns, we control the tactical equation. He looked at Dalton. How are the men holding up? Honestly. Dalton didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried a weight that went beyond simple fatigue. Quote 142. Quote 143, Fletcher said quietly. Quote 144. That night, Garrett stood watch at a position he'd never occupied before, flanked by men he barely knew because the constant rotation meant sections had dissolved into a fluid mass of interchangeable defenders. The wire stretched before him, same as always, but everything else had changed. No routine to fall into, no pattern to rely on, just moment-to-moment existence and the certainty that nothing was certain. The breaking point came not from enemy action, but from within. Blake, the young replacement with the eye twitch that had spread to his hands, was found at dawn sitting in his foxhole staring at nothing, rifle across his lap, completely unresponsive. Davies tried to rouse him, shook his shoulder, called his name. Blake blinked slowly, but didn't acknowledge the corporal's presence. His eyes tracked movement without recognition, like he was watching something happening in a different world entirely. The medical officer, a captain named Rhodes who'd been overwhelmed since the first barrage, examined Blake in the aid station they'd set up in a reinforced dugout. "Combat exhaustion," Rhodes pronounced after checking Blake's vitals and getting no coherent responses to questions. Quote, 146. He looked at Fletcher with an expression that combined sympathy and accusation. Quote, 147. Fletcher absorbed this without visible reaction. Quote, 148. Quote, 149. Rhodes said bluntly. Quote, 150. Quote, 151. Fletcher replied. Quote, 152. But his tone carried less conviction than his words suggested. That afternoon, Wellsworth returned with a Japanese prisoner, a young soldier captured during a failed probe 2 nights earlier. The prisoner had been interrogated at brigade level and had provided information that reframed everything they'd been doing. Wellsworth brought him to the perimeter under guard, used him as a teaching tool in a briefing that gathered what was left of the company's leadership. Quote, 153, Wellsworth said through an interpreter, a Nisei soldier from Hawaii who spoke both languages fluently. Quote, 154. The interpreter spoke to Tanaka, who responded in rapid Japanese. Quote, 155. Quote, 156. Another exchange. Tanaka's response was longer this time, animated. The interpreter translated. He says the Australians do not follow proper military procedures. Every time his observers thought they understood the pattern, it changed. His commanding officer became frustrated, demanded better intelligence. They extended the observation period twice, then a third time. Finally, the commander decided they had waited long enough and ordered attacks based on incomplete information. Dalton leaned forward. Ask him about the casualties. How many men has his unit lost trying to crack this position? Tanaka's face went carefully blank when the question was translated. His answer came quietly. Quote, 159. The number hit like a physical blow. 23 enemy dead against 3 Australian killed and 5 seriously wounded. The mathematics of attrition warfare laid bare. Wellsworth let the information settle before continuing. Quote, 160. Tanaka spoke for almost a minute straight, hands gesturing as he tried to convey concepts the interpreter struggled to render into English. Fletcher dismissed the prisoner and the interpreter, waited until they were out of earshot before speaking. Rhodes interjected. The question hung unanswered because nobody had a good answer. Return to predictability, and the next Japanese unit would exploit it. Maintain irregularity, and more men would break like Blake had broken. There was no clean solution, just choices between different kinds of damage. Garrett learned about the decision secondhand, through Davies, who'd been at a briefing Garrett wasn't senior enough to attend. Quote, 165, Davies explained, checking his watch out of habit, even though the time was still mostly meaningless. Quote, 166. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody, but might keep everyone alive and mostly sane. The perimeter rotations continued their chaotic pattern, but Garrett found he could now count on sleeping at roughly the same time each day, could plan around meals that arrived with something approaching regularity. His mind seized on these small certainties like a drowning man grabbing debris, used them to create the illusion of order in an existence that remained fundamentally unpredictable. 3 days later, a patrol found evidence that the Japanese had indeed withdrawn their observation posts. The cleared areas where scouts had maintained surveillance were abandoned, observation equipment gone, only crushed vegetation and cigarette butts remaining. The enemy had concluded that this position wasn't worth the casualties required to crack it. They'd moved on, looking for softer targets, positions held by units that still followed the manual, that could be timed and predicted and exploited. Fletcher gathered the company for the first time since Morrison's death, standing on an ammunition crate so everyone could see him. His uniform was as filthy as anyone else's, no rank privilege in this mud. Quote 167, he said simply. Quote 168. He paused, looking at faces that reflected various stages of exhaustion and trauma. Quote 169. That night, Garrett stood his watch at 0200, or maybe 0300. Fletcher's compromise meant rotations were still random, even if other aspects of life had stabilized. The jungle was quiet, truly quiet, for the first time in weeks. No observers watching, no patrols probing, just the island breathing in the darkness. But somewhere out there, other Australian units were implementing the same procedures, randomizing their defenses, denying the enemy the patterns they needed. The chaos was spreading, becoming doctrine, transforming from desperate improvisation into official policy. The weeks that followed brought a new kind of normal, though normal was a relative term in a jungle war where predictability meant death. Fletcher's hybrid system settled into something approaching sustainable routine. Meals and rest on schedule, defensive rotations deliberately random. Men stopped breaking quite so often, though Rhodes still had a steady stream of cases like Blake, soldiers whose minds simply gave up trying to make sense of an existence without pattern. Garrett found himself becoming a veteran of controlled chaos, teaching new replacements the strange art of staying alert when you didn't know how long your watch would last. "Don't check your watch every 5 minutes," he'd tell them, passing along Dalton's wisdom. "The time doesn't matter. What matters is the wire, the jungle, the sounds that don't belong. Your relief will come when it comes." Some of them understood immediately. Others took longer, went through their own small breakdowns before accepting that uncertainty was the only certainty they'd get. Word filtered through from other units implementing the irregular rotation doctrine. C Company reported a failed Japanese infiltration that had clearly been planned around obsolete intelligence about shift changes. D Company turned back a probing attack when the enemy found positions manned at unexpected times. Intelligence summaries from captured documents showed a pattern of frustration among Japanese planners, notes indicating that Australian defensive procedures had become impossible to reliably predict. Wellsworth visited periodically with translations of intercepted communications. Enemy officers complaining to superiors that conventional reconnaissance methods were producing contradictory or useless information. Wellsworth told Fletcher during one visit, quote, 173, he smiled without humor. Quote, 174, Fletcher's response was characteristically blunt. Tell brigade they can write all the manuals they want, but they should include a section on the cost. We've accomplished the tactical objective at the expense of men's sanity. Every soldier who breaks from the stress is a casualty, just as real as someone shot. The mathematics work in our favor, fewer dead, more alive. But the wounded aren't all bleeding where you can see it. Rhodes supported this assessment with medical data that made grim reading. Combat exhaustion cases had increased 40% across units implementing irregular procedures, compared to units maintaining traditional schedules. But combat deaths were down 60%. The equation was brutally simple. Men broke instead of dying. From a purely military perspective, broken men could potentially recover and return to duty. Dead men could not. The doctrine was working exactly as intended, trading psychological casualties for physical ones, accepting a different kind of damage in exchange for survival. Dalton, promoted to lieutenant after Morrison's death, took a more philosophical view. Quote, 176, he said one night, sharing a cigarette with Garrett during a brief overlap in their unpredictable schedules. Quote, 177. The Japanese never returned to probe that particular section of perimeter. Intelligence suggested they'd redirected their efforts toward positions further south, units that hadn't yet adopted the irregular rotation methods. Those units learned the hard way what predictability cost, suffered the same casualties from timed infiltrations that had prompted Fletcher's changes in the first place. Eventually, they too implemented randomization, creating a cascading effect across the defensive line. The entire division gradually shifted from traditional procedures to controlled chaos, each unit finding its own variation on the theme of unpredictability. Garrett rotated out when his company was finally relieved, sent back to a rest area that felt alien after months of deliberately disrupted routine. The regularity of scheduled meals and fixed wake-up times was disorienting, almost offensive after so long without it. He found himself waking at random hours, checking positions that didn't need checking, unable to trust the structure because structure had become synonymous with vulnerability. Other veterans from the perimeter showed similar symptoms, an inability to settle into routine because routine had been trained out of them at the cost of too many sleepless nights. Years later, after the war ended and official histories were written, the irregular rotation doctrine merited only a paragraph in most accounts. A footnote about innovative defensive procedures in New Guinea, credited to no specific unit or commander because so many had implemented variations simultaneously. The mathematical results were recorded without context. Reduced casualties, improved defensive effectiveness, acceptable increase in non-combat psychological trauma. The official manual, when it was finally published, reduced months of exhaustion and improvisation to a series of bullet points and recommended procedures. But the men who'd lived through it carried different memories. They remembered watches that lasted forever, or ended too soon. Sleep that came in fragments. The constant edge of uncertainty that kept them alive and slowly wore away their ability to exist in a world with schedules and patterns. They remembered Morrison dying because chaos wasn't chaotic enough. Blake staring at nothing because chaos was too much. They remembered surviving not through superior firepower or brilliant tactics, but through the simple refusal to be predictable, even when predictability was what every human instinct craved. The wire stayed quiet in the end, and the men who guarded it went home, and the lesson was learned and documented and filed away for the next war when someone would need it again. Survival through uncertainty, victory through controlled chaos, life purchased at the cost of comfort and routine and the small mercies of knowing when your watch would end. If you found this story valuable, subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. Your engagement helps bring more untold stories from history to light.